Hey everybody, Emi returns here, and in this video, I'm going to help you set up um, your whole scenario for making games with Lua and Love2d. Now, I wouldn't say this is for beginners to making games and such. If you want to really just get started, you're going to want to look up something like GameMaker or Construct. But if you're ready to start writing all of your own um, code and really getting in deep into making games, then this is definitely your next step. You may be asking yourself, why Love2d? Why should I use Lua? Well, first of all, Lua itself is a very flexible language. It's small. I think it's down to 272 kilobytes, I guess, compressed. And on top of that, it's dynamically typed, which basically just means that whenever you go to work with information, you don't have to say what type of information it is, which isn't true for most other languages. So that really, I feel, makes it accessible for beginners. They're not getting bogged down in real technical syntaxes and things like that. Now, right here, I've got the official Lua website. It's their about page. It can tell you a little bit more about Lua, meaning, history, more reasons why you should use it. It gets pretty technical here. Beyond that, they have the actual Programming in Lua book, entirely free for reading online. It's only the first edition. Newer editions you're going to have to pay for, but for those of you who don't know how to write any Lua code at all, this will be a good resource for you. They also have the entire reference manual for Lua, and this is just going to be lots and lots of technical information. I use this mostly when I'm trying to figure out how to do a specific thing, but that's just because I've had a lot of experience with different languages. You'll probably more be working through these first few sections of the Programming in Lua book. So your first step is going to be installing Love2d. Their website here, love2d.org, already just straight up presents you with all their download links and such. I'm sure most of you are going to be on Windows. They've got installers for both 32 and 64-bit systems. Otherwise, you'll have to use a zipped folder. You can also get zipped for Windows. And for Linux users, there's a installable package for no matter what you're on, which you'll find links for and such. If you go with the installer, it will just, do its whole basic installation download thing. Then you'll get an exe and you can run it. And it's pretty basic. You'll just have to agree. Go ahead and let it use this regular destination folder, C program files love, because later on we're going to be using this location for our text editor. If you want to use a different location, you can. Just remember that when we get to that next part. I already have it installed, so I'm going to quit this setup. I believe Love2d will also install a compiler for you, but I am not 100% certain. I'm pretty sure Love2d will compile Lua software for you. Basically what that means is it translates all the code into byte format for your computer to just read as operations and commands. If it does not, if you have any problems with compiling or anything like that, you can try luadist.org, and it will have instructions for installing. Again, it's got Windows, Linux, Mac. Their wiki has even more detailed information. I'll have all these links available for you in the below the video section. And as I said, you shouldn't actually need this at all. Love2d should compile it for you. But in case it does not and I'm wrong, you'll have this resource. After that, you're going to need a text editor to actually write your code in. I really like Sublime Text. It's pretty, I want to say professional feeling, but also easy to use. It doesn't bog you down with a lot of extra things filling up your screen. but it also has some powerful functionality available to people who need it. So you can kind of, I guess, evolve your coding by utilizing the more advanced functionalities of it as you go. So basically, you're just going to click on this download link. And again, Linux, Windows, Mac. I'm actually on the Sublime Text 3 version. It says it's in beta. I haven't had a single problem with it at all, and I've been using it the entire time. I haven't ever worked with Sublime Text 2. But I'm sure they're both equally good. They really would like you to purchase it, but it can be evaluated for free, and there's no time limit on the evaluation. So if you can't afford it, or I guess if you hate good things, you can just keep using it for free. After you have that downloaded and installed, you'll run it. It'll look a lot like this. You probably won't have this folders on the side. You won't have any files open yet. Now, Sublime Text is going to have a lot of layout and options for you. The best things that I have found so far when I've been using the software is when you go to View, Layout, you can split it into 2 columns, and then you can work with multiple files at the same time, which has been incredibly useful. Really speeds up your efficiency. I would highly recommend doing that at least. Beyond that, you can control things like how it's building, what language it thinks it's working in, the indentation, basically when you go to make a new line that's inside of parentheses, how far in it's going to tab for you, whether it's 2 spaces or 4. I use 4. I think it looks cleaner. You can see there's no actual selection here for the syntax. I think it by default will automatically detect what language you're writing in just off of the file extension, so you shouldn't have to mess with anything like that. Now, after you have it all installed and such, you're actually going to want to be able to build your game from here just by pressing a quick shortcut rather than having to navigate to the actual files and folders with Explorer and dragging and dropping things. So what we're going to do is create a build system here in Sublime Text. What that entails is you go to Tools, Build System, New Build System. And it'll open up this default build information. You're going to populate that with pretty much exactly what I have here. There will be a link to all this text in the video links below. Probably a downloadable too if you really want, but it's not that hard to copy and paste. So anyway, you're just going to paste that in, and all it's saying here is that if we're working in Lua, or if you specifically pick this build, we're going to run the entire program through Love2d. This is where that install path matters from earlier when we installed Love. You'll want this to be pointing to your Love.exe inside of your installed folder. So if you didn't use the default location, you'll have to change this bit, but beyond that, everything should be good. Mine already exists, so I'm not going to save. And then when you're working on your project, you're just going to make sure that your build system that's selected is either Love2d, or it will automatically detect it for you since you'll be working in .lua files. After Sublime Text, I would really suggest you get your mind around GitHub. What GitHub is a repository system for people who really work on any sort of project to collaborate and upload and have backups on the cloud. The cloud. My game is actually 100% open source here on GitHub. I'll probably have that Sublime Text build up here shortly as well. And it's kind of weird to use and install, and it was I want to say it was almost difficult for me even when I first got started with it, but it's been incredibly useful, and everybody should use some sort of repository manager. GitHub's probably the most popular. Anyway, you don't have to do that right now, mostly because it's kind of a longish process. But in the long run, remember GitHub. Alright, after that, you're going to want to set up your just very first game. I have here 50 lines. It's pretty simple, basic, everything you'll need to make a game. You don't actually need most of this. Love has defaults for all these functions. But it's actually really good to write your own here. You'll be learning a lot about what's going on behind the scenes for your game. And on top of that, you'll be able to have a lot of control of these different parts of your game's loop. So our starting position is going to be this love.load function. Basically what we're doing here is just loading in anything that we have in the game. Variables, data structures, pretty much anything that you need to instantiate at the very start of your game or set. All I have here is this table containing a bunch of information for a circle that I've named circle. Very original. And this incrementer that I've set to 5. It's just a variable. Next up we have love.update. What we're doing here is the meat of our game is occurring here. We're calculating everything from AI to menu logic. This love.update is pretty simple. All we're doing is increasing the radius of the circle by our I value. And then if the circle gets too big, we're making I negative so that we can then shrink the circle back down. And it'll loop back and forth continuously. After that, we have love.draw. What we do here is everything that has to do with rendering your game onto the screen. It's going to be all of your graphics. All I do is set the draw color and draw my circle onto the screen. Pretty simple stuff. After that, I've got a event handler here called love.mousePressed. And what event handlers do is whenever a specific event occurs in the game, in this case it's pressing the mouse, this function is going to get called in the game loop. Specifically here, I've just got it randomizing the color of the circle each time the mouse is pressed. Now here is the entire structure of your whole game. What's going to happen here is when your game is run, it's going to call love.run. And at this point, we're going to set up our entire game loop. We're going to load everything we need loaded with that love.load function. And then for the entire duration of the program, we're going to update the game and draw the game. We'll see those actually right here and right here. There's a lot more going on in this loop as well, and I'm going to walk you through all of that right now. So this first value, tick, it's basically our timer for the game. All we're doing is incrementing tick each time we update the game so that we can keep track of, say I have something that occurs at a specific time in the game from an event and I save when it occurred. I save its tick value at that time. Later on I need to look back and say, oh, it's been this long since this event occurred. I can compare the new tick, the new current tick, to that old saved tick value. Tick rate is going to be our fixed time step, and what it's going to do is to allow us to know exactly how much time is passing between calls to update. That way we can make accurate decisions about timers and things like that. If I want something to occur exactly every 5 seconds, then I'll just have to have a timer that just decreases by tick rate on each update, and then when it hits 0, it will have been exactly 5 seconds that have occurred. After that, we have tick delta, and it's basically the amount of time between the last render and the current render, which means that what we're doing in this whole loop is we're actually only going to draw once per frame, but we have to update the game a certain number of times depending on what our fixed time step is. So for example, if from the last frame to the current frame half of a second has passed, this tick rate is going to occur enough times until we get half of a second divided by 0.02. However, we're only going to draw once at the end of all that updating. And so what tick delta is doing is just keeping track of how much time it's been since the last full frame. Alright, and then delta is just a placeholder variable. It's really not that important. The whole thing can be written without delta, but you may want to access it later for some very technical reasons that don't really matter right now. Now we've gotten to the full game's loop. It's this while true do. All we're doing here is repeating this over and over again until we manually break from the while loop. The only way that we're going to manually break from the while loop is right here in this love.quit. It has a return, which basically returns for the function and automatically exits the function that we're currently in, which will just end the game right there. Our entire game is contained in this love.run. So, for each tick, while true do, we're going to step the love.timer, and all that means is that we're going to say we're starting a new tick to Love2d. Love2d will then calculate the new time since the last frame. This delta value will get updated to be the new time since that last frame, the new calculated delta. And then we're going to add that delta to our tick delta. And all we're doing here is we're tacking on any leftover time from the last frame to this delta for the new frame. So say we had a time of 0.51 from our last frame, and we iterated through love.update enough times so that we got 0.51 minus 0.02 minus 0.02, etc. until we had finished updating for that entire frame following our fixed time step. Eventually we'll be left with this 0.01, which isn't enough time to do an entire update. So we're going to actually end up saving that 0.01 and carrying it over to the next frame. And eventually that 0.01 will increase and increase and increase until it's 0.02 or greater. So we'll actually earn an extra tick eventually. And all that's doing is just making sure that we don't lose little tiny amounts of time in our loop, because those can build up over time. It's also, on the flip side, making sure that if we start lagging behind and we can't actually operate through enough love.updates before the next tick starts, it'll still remember how many updates it needs to do, and it doesn't just get so overloaded that it crashes and burns and dies, and then it's sad because of how laggy it is. Anyway, next up in our while loop, we have the actual love.update loop. And all this is saying is, while our tick delta, while our time since the last frame is greater than our fixed time step, do an update tick. So we increment our tick counter by 1. We reduce tick delta by our fixed time step. And then this chunk of code here is handling all of our events. What love.event.pump does is it populates our event queue with any events that have occurred in this tick. And all that means is that if the player pressed the mouse this tick, then we're going to go ahead and mark that down and stick it in our list of events to handle. This for loop here is going to basically iterate through our list of events, and for each event it's going to handle it. So if our event is quit, then we're going to quit the game. However, if our event is mouse pressed, then we're going to call this love.mousePressed function we wrote earlier, where the color randomly changes for our circle. And you'll have a handler for each type of event in your game, whether it's a key pressed or a mouse pressed or anything along those lines. You can even come up with your own events and call them with love.event.push. But for now, all we're using is quit and mouse pressed. If you don't have this quit event, your game will actually hang forever and you'll have to end it through the task manager manually, which is kind of a pain. So make sure you at least have this quit event in here. After we handle events, we do a call to our love.update, which is where our entire game calculates all of its logic. For this specific game, it's just our circle's radius changing. And then after we've called through enough updates for our tick delta to be less than our fixed time step, we do a call to draw. We refresh the entire rendering of the game. And that entails clearing everything that was drawn on the last frame, calling love.draw so that we draw everything that's new for the current frame, and then presenting that to the player, to the person playing the game, the viewer. Lastly, we have this love.timer.sleep for a very small amount of time, 1,000th of a second. This is actually a very important part of our code, because what it's doing here is it's limiting the CPU of the computer, which means that if this wasn't here, if we had it commented out, then it would try to run through this code as fast as it possibly could on the computer's machine. And what that's going to do is really use up your CPU. It can make it get really hot, burn things up. Obviously, the computer's not just going to let your little game burn up the software, but it's still going to try to run as fast as it can. And so if I just leave this uncommented, I'll get a frame rate of just thousands because I'm only drawing this little circle, but I don't need that. Nobody's eye works that fast. So we just have it sleep here for 1,000th of a second, and that just keeps the CPU from getting too crazy with its usage. It'll keep it down to a pretty normal level. You can change it to much smaller values. It won't have much effect on things. 1,000th of a second is going to be good for your needs. And that's our entire game loop. Lastly, we have love.quit, which is basically what gets called when we go to exit the game. You don't actually need anything in it, unless, say, you want the game to save when you go to quit or anything like that. So you won't need it, just know that it exists. Awesome. So let's run this. Since we wrote that build system earlier, I can just hit the build hotkey, which is Control and B by default. And we have our circle that's increasing and decreasing. And so what we're seeing go on each time that this circle changes in size is it's running through enough updates until it's managed to catch up to the amount of time since the last frame, which is probably very small. We're not doing very much. And then it's rendering that circle to the screen. Awesome. So we've got this whole system here, game loop and all. Looks like in 50 lines of code, including some extra line breaks here and there. Pretty easy stuff. A lot of the game loop stuff can get very technical. I'll have this entire file available for you to look at and or download in the links section again. And I'll also have a link that it's basically an article about game loops, and it really talks about how different ways you can do the loop are effective in different ways and why we came to that last loop that I just showed you. I'll have a link to it here. Really good article. 10 out of 10 would read every day. And that should just about cover everything. We've got Sublime Text installed. We've got Love installed. We installed a compiler for Lua if we needed one. We've got resources to learn Love through their whole wiki. We've got resources to learn Lua through their free Programming in Lua book. We've got the reference manual, and we've got the actual Lua website. Comments are great. Go ahead and make sure you visit the stream and the Patreon. That's going to be patreon.com/eatmereturns or twitch.tv/eatmereturns. Watch me make my game in Love, and let me know what else you guys want to see, or if I made any errors. Really anything at all. That's it. Thanks for watching.